She's riling up the troops. She's riling them up to act in whatever way to Pāti Māori demands, even if they don't go to the lengths of physically overthrowing anyone. She's ensuring that she attracts a certain portion of the Māori population to back anything to Pāti Māori steers. Anything. And that is the revolution that they are engaging in right now.
Only the colonized mind, the severely colonized mind, believes so wholly in the system of parliament. And if you're one of those people, you have to check yourself. We all have to check ourselves. Because by investing and subscribing 100% into a model like this, we're committing our mokopuna to another 180 years of injustice. We are committing our mokopuna, the mokopuna that we haven't met yet, to being under the governance of Pākehā. And we're not allowing for them. We're not creating the environment to commit them to tino rangatiratanga. So think about it. We need to pull our heads out our asses and look at it from a bird's eye perspective, eh? What are we actually doing here? The decisions that we're making today, how are they going to impact the mokopuna that we haven't met yet? Really fucking think about that. When are you going to start acting in your sovereign? And while you're thinking about that, you might as well also start thinking about how we're going to take our country back too.
What's funny, actually, what's ironic, what's really ironic about how she ended it, how are we going to take back our country? I do believe Te Pāti Māori raised a few eyebrows at the whole New Zealand First, let's take back our country slogan at the election. Yet all of a sudden, Te Pāti Māori themselves are using that very slogan. Because it's okay to take back your country when you believe in the cause. You see, the likes of Winston Peters, they're trying to take back the country from woke radicals and idiots who try and implement racial separatism in this country. Oh, I mean, like from these people who want to literally implement it on steroids. People thought, hey, Pūpua was bad. This shit's on steroids. This is far worse. This is saying that we Māori, us 3%, despite the fact that our population is 17 to 20%, us 3% who voted for Te Pāti Māori don't recognise the government. No, actually, the idea of our children and our grandchildren being, governed by these white people is disgusting. That is pretty much the vibe here. The idea that anyone who is not Māori governs our children, governs our grandchildren, governs any generation after us is revolting. Because Māori are superior in this area. In fact, the system of parliament is inferior to anything us Māori can dictate. Inferior. The system itself, just full stop, is inferior. Didn't even say inferior for Māori, just inferior. This is a Māori supremacist, ethno-nationalist supremacist movement. Simply no two ways about it. I mean, you cannot listen to what she said and tell me that she isn't an extremist, she isn't a radical, she isn't an ethno-nationalist, that she isn't, quite frankly, a supremacist in her beliefs, that she believes her beliefs are inherently supreme over others, that Māori are supreme over others, that Māori have greater rights and duties under law than others, that Māori are entitled to more than any others. How much more supremacist do you need to get? When do we stop hiding behind the stupid, woke ridiculousness of the 21st century and start acknowledging that, yes, Indigenous populations can be radical, Indigenous populations can be extreme, Indigenous populations can be racist, Indigenous populations can be supremacists. These people are rooted in a decolonization mindset. Decolonization means taking back all control. Well, do you think that even if they take the long game approach of we just want a Māori parliament and to dictate law for all Māori, that they'll stop there? No, they will try everything they possibly can to wrestle as much control out of everything in this country from the hands of Pākehā. The more power they have to do so, the easier it will be for them. And I'm not doing this to scaremonger. I'm doing this to be real, because if no one's going to be real with you, who will be? Who will be? Will you be real with yourself? The media certainly won't. So unless you're sitting there and you're having this conversation with yourself every day, who's going to tell you? Who's going to tell you? The person that the media calls racist for saying it? The people that Party Māori demonize for saying it? Who? Someone has to, and I will. Now, on Thursday, I was at the Toitu Te Tiriti activation, right? And that was the activation that Party Māori organised, because that's what they do. It's their kind of little branch off from their party that they use to activate their little group of radicals or those who are none the wiser to oppose the government whenever they say go. It's a little bit controlling, to be fair. They could essentially in the future just say, hey guys, we're not happy with this group of people meeting over here. We're going to activate you to assert your sovereignty. There is the potential here that this turns into something a little bit more sinister. Nonetheless, when I was there on Thursday, it was very, very lethargic. And this is with respect to the Auckland one. Other ones might have been a bit better. But the issue was, is they met at Aotea Square. The sound system was very poor. You could barely hear anything that was being said. And people, generally speaking, were either disengaged or kind of trying to listen but had no idea what was going on because they couldn't hear anything. The actual march down Queen Street itself was fine. It was, there was noise in pockets, but people were just marching, having a family day out, really. It was uneventful. There was not much to say about it. That being said, it was only done because the Party Māori wanted all eyes on them. They wanted all the attention to be taken away from the budget for whatever reason. They also wanted to capitalise on the budget and claim it's not doing anything for Māori, and therefore this justifies what they're doing even more so. They wanted all the eyes on them, and that's because they declared, the Party Māori, that they wanted Māori political independence. Or that they were just declaring that Māori do have political independence as of right now because they say so. Because they don't believe that the Crown, the government, has any authority over Māori whatsoever, and as such, the idea that they have any right to make laws for Māori, that any of the laws of the Crown, any of the laws of the New Zealand government apply to Māori is preposterous in their eyes. It just doesn't make sense. It's just not true. They don't view it that way. So regardless of the petition that they've sent out getting signatures, they have declared Māori political independence. Simple. And they've had a massive hui since discussing exactly that. And so here is Te Pāti Māori, I believe, Rawiri Waititi himself, declaring this. Today we had the conversation. We have started the conversation. We started the wānanga to organise ourselves in the rangatiratanga, which is the self-determination, the rangatiratanga space. Today we have started the revolution. This is what I meant. Last week I stated they're stoking a revolution, and they've now also officially declared a revolution. We will no longer let decisions made by this house determine our oranga, the oranga of our people, our mokopuna, the land, and te iwi Māori katoa. We now begin the process of establishing our own parliament, making their own parliament, and no one except Māori dictates how that parliament is going to look. Simple. That is what they declared on Thursday. That's why they wanted all eyes on them. Of course, News Hub called it a stunt. Because they're ignorant, because they don't do a little bit of research. Not even a little bit. This is very, very consistent with their policy for a long time. But that's what it is. The media aren't remotely taking this seriously. They think this will blow over. They think Te Pāti Māori will just whatever. In fact, I'm getting the impression that even if they come to the realization that Te Pāti Māori's serious, they don't actually care. That it's just going to be something to cover, and it's just, oh yeah, whatever. It's just constitutional change, whatever. It doesn't matter if it's not going through the democratic process. Doesn't matter if no one seems to care. The thing is, the reason why the general public isn't outraged about this is because the media isn't telling them. Unless you watch the platform, unless you watch the Eerjk McRae show right here, unless you follow the right people on social media, you will be utterly clueless as to the true extent of what's actually going on. You may have heard on News Hub, One News, that Māori have declared political independence, but you've likely also heard that it's just a petition. A petition, which they don't actually care about, it's just there to use as leverage. Because if they can get enough signatures, and they can leverage the government, they can demonize the government further, saying, hey, look, you are going against the will of the people here, sir. They don't care. They don't even want a referendum on this. They just want to do what they want to do. They don't care. All of this is a ploy to do what they want and get away with it. I don't even think the government is going to be able to respond or is willing to respond until it's too late. News Up the other day suggested that Te Pāti Māori was going to put together a proposal of the Māori Parliament and then bring it to government later in the year, as if somehow they were going to bring forward some bill that should be drafted and go through the parliamentary process and go through some process of having a referendum, some legitimate process. No, of course they don't. Have you not been listening to Te Pāti Māori? They do not recognise the system. They do not recognise Parliament. They do not recognise the sovereign. They don't care about what the Parliament says. They don't care about what the general public says. They don't care at all. They're not going to rely on Parliament to pass what they want going through. They don't care about that. They're not going to rely on a referendum hoping of the goodwill of the people to do what they want. No. They're going to bring something to the government and say, hey, government, this is what we're doing. You can either stand in our way or you can just let us pass gracefully. If you stand in our way, well, then I think we might have to go back to what Kitty Tamihere Waititi was saying, which was that we should just assert our sovereignty and do whatever we want. That is what's going to happen. They've stated outright that they can overthrow any government if they're united. This is a tool of unification, albeit by dividing an entire nation. Now, I'll just finish off by acknowledging that the Māori king, Kingi Tuheitia, he has acknowledged that this whole thing frightens him. The idea frightens him, whether he was just doing it in jest, which it was an element of a jest to what he said, but at the same time he looked like, I understand how Māori operate. I understand that Māori are tribal people, that Māori can be very, very stubborn, that Māori certainly like to look out for number one, and when I say number one, I mean hapu before the broader context. So, he understands how complex that will be, especially if it's done in a way which is reliant on each hapu has representatives, and then obviously they want like a two-house system or an upper house and a lower house type vibe, whether or not that's going to be a lower house filled with, hapu representatives and an upper house filled with iwi representatives, or how they're going to do that, it'll be very, very complex, I imagine. But he acknowledges that this is going to be very complex. It is going to have a lot of friction throughout its entirety if it goes through, and I presume the intention is very much to push ahead with it. So he questioned, he's like, do you want to do this? Now, the other thing about this is they've outlined an intention to place Kingi Tuheitia in a spiritual guidance type role, kind of above all else in the house, but as a spiritual guidance type role, almost as if he's making a mockery of the role that the sovereign plays in our current government, in our current parliament. It's a ceremonial role, but you would argue it's one of spiritual guidance in theory, even though no one would listen to King Charles about what they should have for breakfast, to be fair. But I think you get my point, right? It's basically supplanting what the role of the monarch is in our current system and saying, hey, look, we're just going to replicate that in our Māori system just to really stick it to the man one little bit more. And I think that's arguably the most insulting part of it all. Now, if you follow me on X, you'll know that I made an argument about as to why Rawiri Waititi should be arrested and charged with treason. Now, this could arguably be extended to everyone involved with the Toitu Te Tiriti crowd. Could be arguably extended to all of them. And it has raised some controversy. Some people think I'm reaching, that I'm really, really trying to misrepresent what the legislation says. And unfortunately, because the sedition laws were repealed, I kind of have nothing else to rely on except treason. Had the sedition laws not been repealed, 100% he'd be guilty of sedition. 100%. So would his wife. So, there is no denying here that at least 18 years ago, 16 to 18 years ago, he would have been guilty of a crime. Now, I have to make a full-blown legal argument as to why he's guilty. And because it's a full-blown legal argument, I will be reading directly for it because I do not want to misspeak. And I want you to understand as well as possible. Now, this is not me reaching. This is me trying to look at the law as objectively and applying it in the appropriate context of this situation. Because if we do not apply it based on the context of the day, well, then when are we ever going to use something? Laws that are designed to only apply in one situation, really, I mean, why bother with them at all? Especially when they're written in a way where it doesn't clearly only relate to a specific situation, and it does require some interpretation with respect to context. And so, in this context, I am writing this. And you may disagree. That's fine. I'm not suggesting for a second that anyone should actually act on this. I'm just simply saying that I think it's a fair and reasonable argument to make. So, as many of you know, laws and the application of them take a degree of interpretation. Often, interpretation will differ case to case in order to apply them in varying contexts. When laws are created, they may be written in such a way as to fit the most likely scenario said law would be applicable. And it is with this in mind that I make the argument for the immediate arrest of Te Pāti Māori co-leader Rawiri Waititi. Section 73E of the Crimes Act 1961 states uses force for the purpose of overthrowing the government of New Zealand. Now, if you haven't yet heard, yesterday Rawiri Waititi, in conjunction with his party, announced the political independence of Māori. Now, of course, this is a few days ago now. He stated, "We continuously allow this House to assume that it has sovereignty and absolute superiority over Māori. Today we made a declaration in the name of our mokopuna. We would no longer allow the assumption of this Parliament to have superiority or sovereignty over Te Iwi Māori. Today we had the conversation, we have started the conversation, and we started the wānanga to organise ourselves in the rangatiratanga space. Today we have started the revolution." Now, the argument you may now have is that how does this above correspond with the criminal act outlined in section 73E? Allow me to explain. The key words to keep in mind here are force and overthrowing. Now, I'll quickly reread what the actual law says. Uses force for the purpose of overthrowing the government of New Zealand. So bear in mind again the key words force and overthrowing. Force. Make someone do something against their will. In this case, Rawiri Waititi announced the Pāti Māori are organising themselves into the rangatiratanga space, and they're doing so against the will of the sovereign, against the will of the government, against the will of the voting public. They are doing it. They do not care about what the legal process is. They do not care about the will of anyone else. They are forcing us to go along with it, or forcing us to retaliate or do something differently in order to prevent them. It's either we do what they say, or there's consequences. In this case, we can only hypothesize what those would be. Overthrowing. Put an end to something by use of force. Now, we've already established what force is. Put an end to something by use of force. In this case, the Crown's authority, sovereignty over Māori by rejecting any such authority and then establishing a Māori parliament in its place. When you typically think of overthrowing a government, you think of running in there, basically taking out everyone that's in charge and then putting yourself in their place. So instead of applying that to an entire nation, perhaps apply that to an entire ethnicity. Right now, the authority, the sovereignty lies with the Crown with respect to governance, with respect to the laws that apply to Māori. Pretend no one else exists, and that's the status quo. Māori then come in and say, we no longer recognise you. In fact, we don't even need to go into your parliament. We don't even need to throw you out of your office. We're just going to no longer recognise your office and create our own one over here. It's the exact same thing. It's just going about it in a different way. It's just doing it in a non-violent way, seemingly, because they understand that in the current climate, they could arguably get away with that. And that's why they're going to at least try that first. And that's what they're doing. I'll say that again. Overthrowing. Put an end to something by use of force, in this case, ending the Crown's authority, sovereignty over Māori by rejecting any such authority and then establishing Māori Parliament in its place. I don't know about you, but nothing says overthrowing the sovereign like no longer recognising the authority of the sovereign. By no longer recognising the authority of the sovereign, you are overthrowing the sovereign's right. And you're doing it against his will by forcing him to comply with it or else. We don't know what the or else is yet. But Rawiri Waititi's wife's given us a reasonable indication as to what that or else could be. By stating that Māori declare their political independence, rejecting the authority of the sovereign and its government, and declaring the process of establishing a self-determining Māori parliament, despite having no legal authority to do so, Rawiri Waititi has shown the clear intention to commit treason in accordance with Section 73E of the Crimes Act 1961. And some say, no, that's just not reasonable. Not reasonable at all. Well, I mean, sure, you can make the argument that it's not reasonable, but why not? Are they not rejecting the authority of the crown? Are they not rejecting our sovereign? Are they not saying that we are going to, in effect, remove your authority as head of state, remove your authority as governor, and do that role ourselves? It's the same thing. Just because they're not occupying the ninth floor of the beehive, it doesn't mean they haven't done the same thing with respect to the authority and power the government has over Māori. Which, by the way, may sound a little bit sinister that someone would have power and authority, but of course it is done so within the bounds of an electoral system where the voters pick, right? And of course, in an ideal world, we would have a system that's been streamlined a bit more to place more emphasis on those in charge doing the bidding of the people rather than the bidding of themselves and their party donors. So, there's always things where we can improve, but, you don't have to occupy the office of the last government in order to do the same effect as overthrowing the government. So where do we draw the line? I mean, imagine tomorrow, Pāti Māori have officially established the Māori Parliament, and all of a sudden, let's say, 15% of the population goes over and participates in whatever's going on over there. And there'll be a few Māori that stay over, but let's say 15% of Māori go over there, participate in the Māori Parliament, and no longer recognise the sovereign, no longer recognise New Zealand's government at all, in any way whatsoever. It's not two countries, it's just two parliaments, two governments, two sovereigns. Well, one, that's inconsistent with Te Tiriti o Waitangi, so that would be a bit odd. Secondly, that would suggest a separatist nation where people have different rights and duties depending on what parliament they're part of, that parliament, of course, being dictated down ethnic lines. So already we've established that it's a huge issue. But, where to from there? Is that not enough to constitute believing it's treason? What if, on top of that 15%, 40% of the population, let's say all of the Greens and Labour, decided they no longer recognise our government. They no longer recognise the authority of the Crown's government. No longer. And they say, we're going to go establish our own parliament. Well, now 55% of the population is no longer under the authority of the sovereign. So where has the sovereign not been overthrown in this situation? Tell me, where's the sovereign not been overthrown? A week ago, the sovereign had 100% of the authority. We still have to, every law that's passed still has to be signed off by royal assent. Sovereign still has the authority technically, although it's ceremonial. They had 100% of the influence, 100% of the control, in accordance with our election result, of course. And then within a span of a week, they lost 15% of the population who don't recognise them or the sovereign. And then another 40% of the population who don't recognise them or the sovereign. So tell me, where has the overthrowing of the government not happened? Where has it not happened? How can you go from 100% power to 45% power and not have been overthrown in some capacity? I mean, the sovereign really isn't the sovereign anymore because he has a minority stake in the control of the government, in the control of the nation. That is the same thing. It is overthrowing the government. You can't make the argument that it's not. Because treason isn't just about the monarch specifically, it's about the authority of the monarch. The monarch only has power through authority, and if you overthrow that authority over the specific realm, in this case New Zealand, well then you're overthrowing, effectively, the monarch. If tomorrow the Governor-General has no power, then the monarch has no power. That means you've overthrown the monarch in New Zealand. If 55% of the people of the country are following laws not passed by the Governor-General or not given royal assent by the Governor-General, then you have overthrown the government. That is just how it is. I mean, does it not need to be any clearer than that? Where is the line? Now, we had the Māori child in that propaganda video, but we also have Te Pāti Māori in the House of Representatives every other day talking the most ridiculous nonsense you've heard all year. You see, they don't really care about the truth. They don't really care about acting in accordance with what a common, decent person would. No, they care about being explosive. They care about being dramatic. They care about appealing to a very certain subsection of the population. And they do so because if they want to get the revolution they want, well, they have to appeal to people who are prone to being radicalised, people who are willing to fight back against the threat that Te Pāti Māori claims exists. So, for example, they'll talk about our current government and say that the current government wants to exterminate Māori, which is very odd considering that the Deputy Prime Minister is Māori and that this is one of the most Māori-heavy governments in the history of our nation. But, you know, we can move away from that. We simply have to acknowledge here that they will say absolutely anything to advance their point of view. They will say anything to advance their position. Right, and this is the dangerous part. They will say anything and they will likely resort to any means to achieve their goals. Now, of course, their end game is that they want to basically separate themselves from the crown. They want to separate governance of this nation into two groups, people who come under the crown and people who come under the Māori Parliament. The Māori Parliament would be for everyone with Māori descent, and if their policy is anything to go by, if you are Māori, you do not have a choice. You have to go under their rule, and you don't have a choice in that matter whatsoever. That's at least according to their policy, because their policy, it doesn't state to the contrary. So this is the concern here. I know what we can see very, very clearly what they want. The problem is how they're going to go about it is inherently divisive and could lead to some very dark times ahead for this nation. So a prime example of this radical rhetoric in our parliament is from one of their newer MPs, Miriam Meno Kapakingi. And, well, this is probably another justification to get rid of the Māori seats, because in absence of the Māori seats, such a radical with such divisive and, quite frankly, repugnant views would not be in our parliament. So what has she had to say in recent weeks?
The parties of the government have doubled down on the extermination agenda for Māori. My use of that word, hold tight, my use of that word made a lot of you uncomfortable, and I'm glad to hear it. The repeal of Section 7AA is a targeted extermination of our babies. Hold tight, don't have feelings yet. Exterminating any ounce of culture, identity, and any sense of their Māori selves. What many don't have the cultural intellect, despite any other intellect, to understand is that a Māori person is different to a Pākehā. Moana Jackson in He Whai Pānga Hou said, a Māori person is shaped by cultural forces which are unique to their being Māori, and is subject to influences which are consequent upon that sense of Māoriness. So I speak to all the Māoris in this room. Let that sink in. Let that sink in. And if you don't, you've declared to the whole House who you actually are.
Recently in the House, she stated that the government has doubled down on their extermination agenda of Māori. And then she goes on to say that she sees that it made many people in there uncomfortable, and that she's glad to see that we're uncomfortable. Now, of course, she's glad to see that we're uncomfortable because it allows her to play into this idea that, you know, white people or people opposed to her party, people opposed to her position, are trying to reject history. That this is an act of oppression by pretending that this is some nonsensical thing, or that it is an inherently defensive move to feel uncomfortable, and that by feeling uncomfortable, it suggests that there is validity to what she's actually said. And she simply has absolutely no regard for the kind of language she's using, which is very, very much inflammatory. She's stating that the repeal of Section 7AA in the Oranga Tamariki Act is the act of exterminating Māori through the erasure of their culture and their identity. And the reason for that is because it would mean that no longer do we prioritize culture over the well-being of children. Because that's essentially the reason why the Section 7AA within the Oranga Tamariki Act is being repealed, because it allowed, or at least it increased the likelihood of reverse uplifts, which means, let's say a child is Māori and they're adopted, or not quite adopted, but in care, I should say, foster care, and they're with a family that is non-Māori. Let's say they've been with them a couple of years, which has been the case in some of these instances, and they're in a very loving household. They're doing very, very well. By the looks of it, they're going to go on to great things. But Section 7AA, all of a sudden, the social workers in question and all of the people involved with the Oranga Tamariki making these kinds of decisions have a look and realise, we've just realised that there's this Māori family that is distantly related to them. And because they are Māori, if we do not put them with this Māori family, even though they're in a very, very good household now for the last couple of years, if we don't put them with this Māori family, well, then we're erasing their culture, that we are failing them, that they will not be successful, because it's Māori culture which allows Māori people to be successful. And it is inherently genocidal to not place a Māori child with a Māori family, even if the family that they're with, which was escaping from their dysfunctional Māori family, is one that is actually good for them. It doesn't matter how well they're doing in school, doesn't matter how loving the family is. No, we will remove you from that family, and we will place you with distant relatives like you've never met them, and we'll just roll the dice, see what happens. In some cases, in at least one case that I know of, I believe it was a girl. She was with a family that was non-Māori for quite some time, was doing very, very well. She was removed from that family, placed with a distant relative who happened to be Māori, and she was abused. She was placed with the non-Māori family because of abuse. She was removed and then faced abuse again, and she was only removed because she is Māori, and they decided that white people can't look after you, or whatever ethnicity that family happened to be, because only Māori know how to look after Māori. That is the core reason why Section 7AA is being repealed, because we want to reduce the likelihood of ridiculous decisions like that happening. Prioritizing someone's ethnicity and their culture over their well-being is, quite frankly, barking mad. And they'll sit there and argue that, oh yes, but being embraced within your culture is part of your well-being. Sure. But if I am doing very, very well, and I'm going to go on to live a very successful life, why place me with people who have, quite frankly, no ability to provide better than what I already have, especially because when you do grow up, you have the ability, especially if you're doing well for yourself, especially if you're in a good place, to go and embrace your culture. Like, for example, right now, people may not know this, I am Māori by heritage, or at least one element of it, and I've grown up for the most part with absolutely zero exposure to it. In recent years, I've learned a lot more about it. And I'm one of the only people in my family that embrace it to the level that I do. For example, I'm very, very proud to state my iwi, which is Te Whānau Apanui, whereas no one in my family really mentions that at all. And hey, I can make the deliberate choice now as an adult to go learn more. I could go to a tikanga course tomorrow, and I've dabbled on that in the past as well. You know, I've spoken at Pōhiri before, in Māori. You know, these are things that are available to me despite the fact that I wasn't, strictly speaking, raised in a family which even discussed Māori culture. And that wasn't because my family has anything against Māori culture. That's simply because, for the most part, we were a European family. I mean, my mum's parents were British. my dad's parents were, whilst on this occasion having to have the Māori line connected, we're still South African and Scottish. So, I mean, you know, for the most part, I am European, and that's quite apparent when you look at me, isn't it? But that doesn't stop me. That doesn't stop me in my adult life embracing my culture, because I'm allowed to. There are many, many elements of my culture, of my ethnic background, which I have even less exposure to, even less knowledge of than Māori. So if in order to succeed, you need to be embraced within your own culture, well, then I'm doomed to fail because there is so much about my ethnic background that I'm absolutely clueless about. There is so much about the culture related to my relatives from Eastern Europe that I'm absolutely clueless about. So the whole premise that the Party Māori like to approach this argument from is not only done in a way that is inherently divisive, but it's not even based on reality at all. And Kapakingi essentially finishes by not only calling the entire parliament a bunch of people that lack intellect simply because they don't agree with her, but they lack cultural intellect, which whatever the hell that means. But, outside of that, she doubles down on the idea that Māori are driven by cultural factors, whereas apparently no other group of people are. No other people are based on their culture. I mean, literally that's what differentiates cultures is the differences in culture and how those cultures shape how you live. I mean, there's a very real reason why there are certain standards of discipline in, let's say, Chinese households relative to that of let's say, an English household. The standards, the cultural differences are there for all to see. I live with my dad at the moment as well as his Thai wife. Now, she has very different expectations of someone my age and what position I should be in based on the cultural expectations in her home country of Thailand. And that's not because it's the only way to do something. For example, if I was living in the way that is expected in Thailand, I mean, sure, I'm very much sure I would be in a different position. The point being is I don't need to live one way or the other. I need to live in a way that works for me, works to advance my life, works to improve my quality of life and my well-being across the board. Do I need to rely solely on a culture related to myself to do that? No. Just as Māori don't need to rely solely on Māori culture to succeed, that would be utterly ridiculous. To suggest that one culture has a superior way of living is basically the grounding of every ethnic supremacist movement ever. And sure, she may say, oh, yes, but this only applies to Māori. So, for example, we don't expect non-Māori to live this way. We just expect Māori to live this way. Okay, and why don't you expect non-Māori to live this way? Well, I would imagine the argument is because, well, they're not Māori, so they can't have the same relation to, this as us. That being said, the issue with her position is that it simply is not based on facts. There is not one set way for a human to live. Humans are very, very diverse. And it's, for that matter, pretty much every single Māori you'll meet is not just plain, simple Māori, are they? And last I checked, we dictate what we are. We dictate what culture we want to, adapt to. So, for example, tomorrow I could move to Japan if Japan wanted me, of course. And I could decide for the rest of my days to live very much in accordance with Japanese culture. I may thrive doing so. It is all about individual choice, and the government should certainly not dictate what culture someone grows up in. They should dictate only if a family is extremely, extremely dangerous to a child, and whether or not that child needs to be taken care of in an environment that is not dangerous. And that is fundamentally the point of uplifting children from families and taking them to new households. Reverse uplifts decide, we don't care if the household's good for you, we're going to remove you anyway because you don't have the right cultural views. But if I'm completely honest, I don't actually think Te Pāti Māori cares all that much about Section 7A8. No, it's just a very, very great opportunity to advance their cause, which is to implement a segregated society. Not just segregated by you can't go into this place and you can go into this place, segregated by law. As in, we can both walk down the street at the same time, sure, no problemo. However, I've got one set of laws and you've got another set of laws. My laws are dictated to me by the Crown and your laws are dictated to you by Māori. Or the other way around, because obviously it's Māori that want this, or at least Te Pāti Māori that want this. And this is the problem. They want to implement a system a bit like the systems that you see with the UK, where you've got Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales with their own devolved powers in their national assemblies. But the reason why that works and it's not segregation is it's within certain boundaries, right? Scotland's a actual region, Wales is a region, Northern Ireland's a region, and every single person, regardless of ethnicity, if they are within that region, the law applies to them. No, what Te Pāti Māori wants is one, either for every bloody Pākehā to ship out, and that kind of solves this issue, but they want to have the laws that they make apply to Māori and Māori alone, the systems in place to apply to Māori and Māori alone, and for everyone to live in the same place. We're talking husband and wife could have different rights under the law, which, funnily enough, breaches the very document that Te Pāti Māori will cite justifies doing this. Now, the top story this week, or at least it should have been, had the mainstream media actually picked up on it when they should have, is the whole Manurewa Marae scandal. Now, this has been in the news for a little over a week now, and yet the mainstream outlets like One News and News Hub have only been discussing it really a couple days. It's simply not good enough at all. But it just goes to show that if it doesn't fit the agenda, the mainstream media doesn't care. And in this case, they were forced to speak on it because there's 12 government agencies investigating it. So what is the Manurewa Marae scandal? Well, there's a couple kind of elements to it. But essentially, on one hand, you've got Takatai Tash Kemp, who is now the MP for Tamaki Makaurau, a Te Pāti Māori MP, who has turned up on election day, which is not really the right thing to do, to turn up at a polling booth on election day. They've also been allegedly breached the Electoral Act by committing the offence of treating during a certain time period leading up to the election. And additionally, on top of all of that, we've got some alleged misuse of data, or even collection of data, which is related to the Waipareta Trust and so forth, which is all through John Tamihere, who, by the way, is the Te Pāti Māori president. So it all kind of links in very nicely there. And I've got a couple things on there which links that even more. A couple things here to say which links to that even more. But it's I'm going to do this in a very simplistic manner. I want to go over just the key points. There's a lot of articles at the moment, a lot of insights that people have that are personal insights, I should say, that you can find online relatively easily, particularly on X at the moment, which will give you a much more in-depth insight into this. And so I would recommend doing so. But I'm just going to go over some key points here. Firstly, Takatai Tash Kemp, who is now the MP for Tamaki Makaurau for Te Pāti Māori, showed up on election day with her family from Taupo. Now, you really shouldn't be showing up at the polling booth as the MP of that electorate, or as the candidate for that electorate. Nonetheless, she did. I'm sure she can try and explain that away. Fortunately for her, it's a pretty high threshold, and that's the most minor of the offences, quite frankly. And it's worth noting she showed up to the Manurewa Marae polling booth, to my knowledge, and she was at the time the CEO, or the chief executive, of the Manurewa Marae. And so that shows the conflict of interest, that shows that she has a lot of control over what's going on there, and so it makes sense that she could get away with this behaviour. Additionally, there's the alleged breach of the Electoral Act in the offence known as treating. Now, treating is let's just say, in a certain time period before the election, a political party, a candidate, so forth, they cannot do anything that would be probably consistent with a bribe. So, for example, they can't give away free food to, essentially convince people to vote a particular way, or for it could be misconstrued that way, for example, right? So before the election, in that time period where treating is not allowed, I bumped into now Takanini MP of the National Party, Rima Nakali. Now, Rima Nakali, lovely lady, I met her, had a chat, 10, 15 minutes. Now, she explained to me what treating was, and so she because I met her at the coffee club, and so that's the context. So we were having a quick chat, and she was explaining this to me because it's fundamentally important that she made that clear, not that I expected her to do anything of the sort, of course, but she explained that to me. And the fact that was the first thing that came to mind shows that she has integrity, shows that she was actively trying to abide by the Electoral Act. She was not going to be caught out breaking any of the rules there. So that was my first real insight into treating. And that was, I think, September, October last year. And that's something that Te Pāti Māori seemingly haven't followed, because they were advertising the following: free food at the polling booth, free hangi, donuts, hot chocolate, coffee on proof of voting. Now, this is being advertised by Te Pāti Māori for us. They now deleted those posts because obviously it doesn't look good, does it? Now, that is just point blank treating. I don't know why the threshold is supposedly so high and too high for that to be referred to the police, as the Electoral Commission has decided not to refer that to the police. I do not know what more you want. Like, seriously, we all know, anyone following Te Pāti Māori socials at that time knows this was happening. There were allegations of it on the day, in the days following. The fact that, one, it's taken months for us to get to this point, and for the Electoral Commission to turn around and say, nah, we're not referring that as a matter to the police or anything like that. We're not considering that needs much more input. I mean, I don't trust the Electoral Commission fundamentally. It just makes no sense. I feel like if this was a different political party, they might be taking a different stance. Now, additionally, Te Pāti Māori merchandise was allegedly handed out amongst electoral staff. Now, of course, these are staff rather than actual voters themselves, but if it was at all present and visible to those voting, I mean, that's not particularly good look either, and so that's something else that is being looked into, or at least it very much should be. But ultimately, it's a high threshold for all this stuff, and that's why the Electoral Commission hasn't referred it to the police. Now, I have it on very good authority from a very reliable source that a Waipareta Trust board member with no affiliation with Manurua Marae at all was actually at Manurua Marae on at least the main polling day, if not every polling day, and was basically like an usher at the door. Now, he was described as giving off a mafia-type vibe. You know, the vibe of he's there, but his intentions aren't very clear. You kind of know there's something a little bit fishy and off going on. That's the vibe. And that was the vibe that he gave off the day it happened. This is not some hindsight vibe. This is a vibe that was very much present and aware and commented on at the time by this individual, and, of course, doubling down on it now. So the fact that this guy on the Waipareta board is there in the first place is weird. The fact that he's then ushering people in is weird, and the fact that he's giving off a vibe that he's kind of there for alternative reasons that aren't really what meets the eye, that also suggests that something fishy is going on. And as we can see with this investigation, something fishy indeed was going on. Not only did we have Takatai Tash Kemp show up, but we had several allegations of the Electoral Act being breached. And all of it seems to be centered around Manurua Marae and the Waipareta Trust. Interestingly, the Waipareta board member, whilst having no affiliation with Manurua Marae, is, of course, working for the Waipareta Trust, right? The Waipareta Trust chief executive being John Samihere also being the president of Te Pāti Māori, and the candidate who was chief executive of Manurua Marae being Takatai Tash Kemp. So, the affiliation isn't there, but it's also there, right? You can understand why he was actually there, even though, technically speaking, he probably shouldn't have been. To conclude, this just really highlights that Te Pāti Māori has no regard for our systems. They don't have any regard for maintaining the integrity of our systems. I mean, of course, in the last couple of weeks, they've rejected our parliament outright. They've rejected the authority of our parliament. But also in the process of getting elected to our parliament, they've allegedly breached several parts of the Electoral Act. They've clearly pushed the boundaries as far as they possibly can to the point where they've likely broken them. They're lucky that we have a seemingly compliant electoral commission who's going to let them get off scot-free without referring the matters to the police, which still doesn't make any sense to me. How is there not enough evidence in this case to show that they have clearly breached that act? I don't know. But whatever. There are many, many, many government agencies investigating this, and maybe that'll apply some pressure. Maybe that'll result in something occurring here. Maybe that'll result in consequences. Maybe that will result in a by-election. I don't know. Should there be a by-election? Based on what I've heard and seen, there bloody should be. You may disagree. Ultimately, I'm all for Te Pāti Māori packing up and shipping off tomorrow with respect to their officers in Wellington. Because they've got no respect for our parliament. They don't recognise it at all anyway. So why bother showing up? Why bother taking the seat away from the likes of Penny Henare, who I've met on one occasion? I'm not particularly a fan, but hey, I don't believe in getting cheated out of a seat either. And I'm not saying that that's a fact that he was cheated, but this doesn't look good. There was treating allegedly going on. I mean, there's social media posts basically proving it, even if they have been deleted now. There was Tash Kemp showing up on the day at the polling booth in the electorate that she is standing for. There was the alleged misuse of data from the Waiparaira Trust to enable them to try and transfer people from the general roll over to the Māori roll in order to help boost their numbers vote-wise. This is all linked, and it's all very, very fishy. Ultimately, when we come back to it all, John Tamihere is at the centre of all of this. Even though we can try and hide behind a range of different things, John Tamihere is the focal point of everything happening with Te Pāti Māori, everything happening with this particular controversy with Manurewa Marae, with Waiparaira Trust, all of this. He is one of the most corrupt individuals in this country with respect to politics and respect to these kind of iwi-led organisations and so forth. He cannot be trusted. He lacks integrity. And that's truly saying something about politicians, because we all know how it goes. You can't trust a politician as far as you can throw them.